The sun had barely climbed over the rooftops, casting a warm amber glow across the quiet cul-de-sac. Birds chirped in the distance, and the gentle rustle of trees swaying in the early morning breeze filled the air. It was one of those rare Saturdays where everything felt still and calm, the kind of morning that begged for nothing more than a cup of coffee, a comfortable chair, and the sweet luxury of doing absolutely nothing. I had just settled into my patio seat, mug in hand, enjoying the soft steam rising into the crisp air. The house smelled of toast and lavender candles, and somewhere inside our dog was lazily padding around, hoping for a second breakfast. Inside, my wife was finishing her shift as a remote 911 dispatcher. She worked early mornings, usually clocking out just before most people even poured their first cup of coffee. Her calm, reassuring voice often helped people through some of the worst moments of their lives. Yet in person, she was warm, a little sarcastic, and fiercely protective of those she loved. Today was her last shift of the week, and we had plans to spend the rest of the day catching up on shows and maybe hitting the local farmers market later. That's when the knock came. No, not a knock. More like an aggressive pounding, rhythmic and intentional, breaking the silence like a hammer through glass. I flinched, nearly spilling my coffee. At first, I thought maybe a neighbor needed help, or there was some kind of emergency. I stood, walked to the front door, and peeked through the side window. That's when I saw her. There she stood, with oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, a clipboard in one hand, and an expression that could curdle milk. I'd never met her personally, but I'd heard the stories. Every neighborhood has one. Her name was Karen. Of course it was. And she was infamous around here. President of the HOA, self-appointed enforcer of bylaws, and general neighborhood busybody. She had that peculiar way of dressing like she was headed to a garden party at all times. Wide sun hat, floral blouse, capri pants that were always just a little too tight. And always that same determined scowl, like she was personally offended by every car parked slightly over the line or lawn gnome out of place. I opened the door halfway, keeping my hand on the knob. "Good morning," I offered, trying to keep my tone friendly but cautious. She didn't return the pleasantry. Instead, she marched forward as if expecting me to step aside and grant her entry like a footman at Buckingham Palace. "I need to access your backyard. There's a violation I need to inspect," she said flatly. I blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry, what?" "There's a possible infraction involving your fence line and unauthorized modifications. HOA protocol gives me the right to verify," she continued, lifting her clipboard like it was a badge. That peaceful Saturday morning I had so looked forward to. Gone in an instant. Something told me this wasn't going to be just a brief conversation. She stood there with the kind of confidence only someone deeply convinced of their own authority could possess. The clipboard didn't shake in her hand. It remained as rigid and upright as her posture. Her hat cast a shadow over her face, but not enough to hide the pursed lips and narrowed eyes that scanned me like I was an unkempt lawn or a rogue trash bin left out past collection day. The air around her seemed to thicken with judgment, and for a moment I wondered how many neighbors had stood in this exact spot, facing her unsolicited wrath. "I'm here on official HOA business," she announced again, as if the first declaration hadn't landed hard enough. "You're blocking an inspection, and that's a serious offense." I shifted my weight and leaned a bit on the doorframe, trying not to laugh. "Karen, right? I don't remember getting any notice about an inspection." She exhaled dramatically, the way someone might after being forced to explain to a child why fire is hot. "Notices are a courtesy. For emergencies and suspected violations, I can act immediately." "Emergency?" I asked, eyebrows raised. "You mean the fence that hasn't moved in 5 years suddenly became a threat to the community?" She didn't appreciate the sarcasm. Her grip on the clipboard tightened, and she took a small, assertive step forward, trying to peek around me into the house. I instinctively adjusted my stance, not allowing her a view. She didn't ask to come in, she assumed. That was her way. Entitlement wrapped in bylaws and printed out regulations no one but her ever read. "You're obstructing an official process," she barked. "I'm authorized to enter common access areas." "This isn't a common access area. This is my private backyard. You need permission, or at least something in writing from the board." I replied calmly, watching her face begin to twitch in frustration. She didn't back down. Instead, she pointed the clipboard toward the side gate. "Then let me through the side. I won't go near your house. I'll just measure the fence line and be gone." I shook my head. "Not happening. Not today." Karen stared at me like I had just kicked her poodle. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and then did what every true believer in HOA supremacy eventually does when denied. She pulled out her phone. "You're going to regret this," she said coldly. "I'm calling the police." Karen stepped back just enough to give herself room, then dialed with the same theatrical flair you'd expect from someone reporting a hostage situation. She put the call on speaker, holding the phone up like it was her sword of justice. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching with a strange mixture of disbelief and curiosity. There was no yelling yet, no real drama, just the anticipation that something unnecessary was about to unfold. "Yes, I'd like to report a hostile resident who is refusing to comply with HOA policy and preventing me from doing my job," she told the dispatcher, her voice already dipped in syrupy distress. "He's acting aggressive and might be hiding something." My eyes widened. "Aggressive? I'm standing on my own porch drinking coffee." She turned her back toward me, as if cutting me out of the scene made her story more real. "Yes, the address is," she began, and I could tell by her tone she was waiting for the dispatcher to leap into action, to validate her inflated sense of urgency. What she couldn't know, was that the woman on the other end of the line was my wife, sitting in our home office with her headset on, listening in real time. Inside, my wife's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she processed the details. Her eyebrows raised slightly when she heard our address. She muted her mic for a moment and sent me a text. "She's calling about you." "Don't worry, I've got this." Outside, Karen kept glancing over her shoulder, probably hoping to see me sweating under pressure. Instead, I smiled, which seemed to confuse her. "I feel threatened," she added, raising her voice just enough for nearby houses to hear. "He's blocking me and refusing to let me pass. You need to send someone right away." She wasn't yelling, but the pitch was rising, like a kettle, just before the whistle. A few curious neighbors peeked through their curtains. One man across the street even stepped onto his porch, arms folded, watching quietly. Karen noticed him and gestured wildly, as if rallying support. "This isn't over," she snapped, ending the call with the confidence of someone who believed backup was already en route. She turned to me again, eyes blazing with righteousness. "You'll be sorry," she said. "You messed with the wrong woman." I almost laughed, but held it in. She really had no idea. Inside the house, my wife sat at her workstation, sipping the last of her lukewarm tea as she prepared to log off. Her shift had been mostly quiet, routine medical calls, a minor fender bender, and a cat stuck in a drainpipe. Then Karen's voice came through her headset, loud and laced with manufactured urgency. "I need officers dispatched immediately. A man is being aggressive and won't let me onto his property. I'm with the HOA." At first, my wife listened like she would to any other call, fingers resting lightly on the keyboard, logging the basic information. Then, Karen gave the address, and my wife froze. Her eyes flicked up to the small digital clock on her screen, then to her phone, which buzzed with my name lighting up the screen. She didn't answer the text right away. Instead, she kept listening, her professional instincts overriding her personal curiosity. The caller kept rambling, painting herself as the victim in broad strokes. She claimed she was being blocked, that there could be safety issues, that a homeowner was becoming uncooperative and possibly violent. My wife's brows knit together. She knew my temperament better than anyone. Aggressive was the last word anyone would use for me, unless someone tried forcing their way onto our property uninvited. With a composed tone, she replied through the headset, "Can you clarify what makes the situation unsafe, ma'am?" Karen hesitated, clearly unprepared for follow-up questions. Well, he's not allowing me to inspect for violations. He's standing in my way and raising his voice. My wife muted herself for a second, rolled her eyes, and finally texted me back. Yep, it's her. Stay cool. Officers are on their way, but I'm briefing them. Outside, I stood on the porch, arms folded, watching Karen pace in tight circles like a general waiting for reinforcements. She had no idea the woman on the other end of the call, so calm, so attentive, was married to the man she was trying to get arrested. Back inside, my wife finished the dispatch report, but not before flagging the responding officers with a quick note. Caller is a known HOA rep with a history of exaggerating reports. Homeowner is my husband. Situation is nonviolent. She sent it off with a soft click, leaned back in her chair, and smiled. Let's see how this plays out, she murmured. The call continued, and Karen's voice took on a more dramatic tone with every passing second. She spoke in clipped sentences, inserting pauses as if waiting for the dispatcher to express shock or outrage. But my wife didn't take the bait. She kept her voice neutral, professional, not once letting on that the man Karen was ranting about was the one she shared a home and a life with. Is the individual armed or threatening you in any way? She asked evenly. Karen scoffed. He doesn't have a weapon, but his attitude is threatening enough. He's obstructing official HOA duties and refusing lawful entry. That's intimidation. In the kitchen, my wife muted her mic and let out a quiet laugh. She stood up and peeked through the blinds, catching a glimpse of Karen pacing like she was preparing for a press conference. I was still calmly standing on the porch, now sipping a fresh cup of coffee, completely unfazed. My wife shook her head, then turned back to her screen, flipping through the incident log. With a few quick strokes, she pulled up a summary of the last few complaints Karen had made, none of which had resulted in anything beyond mild inconvenience. Returning to the call, she kept her voice steady. Officers are on the way, ma'am. Please remain calm and avoid further confrontation. Karen nodded to no one in particular. I will, thank you. I just hope they get here before things escalate. Muted again, my wife smirked. There wasn't a single thing escalating, except for Karen's performance. A few minutes later, after wrapping the call and updating the officers en route, my wife stepped away from her desk. She poured herself another cup of tea and wandered out to the front hallway, staying out of sight for now. She didn't want to interfere directly. This had to play out naturally, but she wanted to be close when it happened. Close enough to hear the moment Karen realized she had made a very big mistake. She texted me again, short and sweet. I took the call. She has no clue. Outside, I read the message and smiled. Karen stood by the curb now, looking up the street for flashing lights. She didn't realize that the voice she had just fed her lies to. The calm, collected professional on the other end of her 911 call wasn't just any dispatcher. She was my wife. The distant hum of an approaching engine broke the silence, and Karen immediately perked up like a sentry spotting cavalry on the horizon. A patrol car rounded the corner and slowly pulled into the cul-de-sac, lights off, engine purring. Karen waved them down with her clipboard raised high, like a flag of self-importance. The two officers stepped out, calm and observant, already briefed by my wife on what to expect. They approached us without urgency, taking in the scene with trained eyes. No weapons, no shouting, just a woman with far too much confidence and a man holding a coffee cup. "Good morning, sir," the taller of the two said to me, offering a polite nod. "We received a call about a possible disturbance." I nodded and gestured toward Karen, who jumped in without invitation. "Yes, thank you for coming. This man has been extremely uncooperative. I'm with the HOA and was attempting to inspect his property for violations. He became aggressive and blocked me. He wouldn't let me through the gate. I feared for my safety." The officers exchanged a quick glance, but kept their faces neutral. The shorter one turned to me. "Is that accurate?" I shrugged. She showed up unannounced, demanded access to my backyard, and when I said no, she started yelling and called you. That's the whole story. Karen scoffed. "I didn't yell. I raised my voice for clarity. And as an HOA official, I have the right to access shared spaces for enforcement." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, this is clearly private property. Do you have documentation authorizing entry or a warrant of some kind? Karen bristled. I don't need a warrant. I have jurisdiction. No, ma'am, the taller officer said gently. You don't. HOA rules do not override property laws or state trespassing statutes. Unless you have written consent or an emergency verified by the board, you're not permitted to enter someone's yard. Karen looked stunned, like the rug had been yanked out from under her. Her mouth opened, then closed. She turned to me and pointed. He wouldn't even listen. The second officer pulled out a notepad. We also reviewed the call transcript. Dispatch flagged this as a potential misuse of emergency services. We're not issuing a citation today, but we strongly advise against making non-emergency calls in the future. Karen's face flushed a deep, furious red. She had come expecting backup, authority to validate her ego. Instead, the weight of reality began to sink in. Karen stood frozen, her fingers tightening around the edge of her clipboard as if it were the last shield between her and accountability. The officers, polite but firm, were clearly no longer buying the story she had tried to sell. The taller one took a slow step toward her, lowering his voice just enough to make her lean in, perhaps hoping for a private show of support. But what he said next shattered that hope. Dispatch confirmed some background on the caller, he said. We were told to proceed cautiously. Not because of the homeowner, but because of your history with exaggerated reports. Karen blinked. What? That's ridiculous. The second officer turned slightly toward me, clearly more relaxed now, even a bit amused. You didn't raise your voice, did you? Any threats? Not unless you count asking her to leave as a threat, I replied calmly. She showed up demanding access to my yard. I refused. That was it. The officer nodded and jotted something into his notebook, then looked back at Karen. You understand that calling 911 for anything that isn't an immediate threat to life or property is misuse of emergency services, right? Karen opened her mouth, then paused. But I didn't know. The taller officer interrupted. That your dispatcher was his wife? He gave her a look that wasn't unkind but firm. No, you didn't. But maybe if you'd taken a breath, instead of jumping to conclusions, you wouldn't be standing here right now explaining yourself. Karen's eyes darted between us, the edges of her confidence beginning to fray. Her grip on the clipboard finally loosened as her shoulders sagged slightly. I was just doing my job, she mumbled, not quite ready to surrender her pride. The second officer shook his head slightly. Your job doesn't include trespassing or misusing emergency resources. I didn't gloat. I didn't have to. The silence did the work for me. Karen finally took a step back, eyes flicking from the officers to me, then toward my front door, as if some part of her had finally put the pieces together. A dispatcher, with that calm, even tone. The one who asked very specific questions. The one who knew just how to flag the call. That was your wife, she whispered, disbelief and embarrassment mixing in her voice, like oil and water. I gave her a small smile. Yup, and she says hi. Karen stood there as if the air had been knocked out of her. The smugness that had carried her through the morning drained from her face, replaced by a flicker of something she rarely showed. Vulnerability. Her mouth opened, then closed again, the words tangled somewhere between pride and panic. She looked at me as though seeing me for the first time, her bravado dimming under the weight of realization. You're telling me, she said slowly, almost in disbelief, that I just called 911 on someone whose wife is the dispatcher? I nodded once, casually sipping my coffee. Pretty wild, huh? One of the officers stifled a chuckle, while the other cleared his throat, clearly trying to keep the moment professional. Karen's eyes darted toward the house, as if hoping my wife would step out and tell her it was all some big misunderstanding. But no one came, just the quiet buzz of a Saturday morning returning to normal. She tried to recover. Well, I didn't know. If I had... But you didn't, I cut in gently, still calm. And that's kind of the problem, isn't it? You just assumed, like you always do. Karen flinched at that. The truth had landed, and it stung. Her shoulders stiffened, but there was no fire left behind her eyes. Just the quiet humiliation of someone realizing they'd played a game they couldn't win. She glanced at the officers one last time, searching for support that wasn't there anymore. "Have a good day, ma'am," one of them said, clearly signaling the end of the encounter. Karen turned slowly, walking back to the sidewalk without another word. The once mighty storm had dwindled to a breeze, and in that moment, peace began to settle again, sweet, quiet, and completely earned. Karen walked away with the stiff, robotic posture of someone trying to preserve the last shreds of dignity. Her clipboard bounced awkwardly at her side, her steps quick and uneven as if she couldn't get away fast enough. The officers didn't follow her. They simply watched until she disappeared down the sidewalk, then gave me a nod and returned to their cruiser without another word. No handcuffs, no ticket, just the quiet weight of embarrassment trailing behind her like a shadow. As she rounded the corner and vanished from sight, a few neighbors who had quietly gathered behind curtains and screen doors began to trickle back inside. One or two lingered a moment longer, offering subtle smirks or a thumbs up my way. I returned a polite wave, more amused than anything else. The front door creaked open behind me, and my wife stepped out, still in her headset, a mug of tea cradled in her hand. She leaned against the doorframe and looked at me with a raised brow. "So, how'd I do?" I laughed. 10 out of 10. Would dispatch again." She grinned and sipped her tea. She didn't suspect a thing. "She knows now," I said, glancing down the street. "Pretty sure she won't be knocking again anytime soon." "Good," my wife replied, stretching her back. "Maybe now we can enjoy the rest of our Saturday without any surprise visits." We stood there for a moment, just letting the calm settle back in. The sky was still bright, the breeze still gentle, and the world finally felt quiet again. With one final sip of my coffee, I turned back toward the house. "Next time someone comes to inspect my fence, I'm calling you first." She smiled. "You better." The fallout from Karen's failed mission came quietly, like a ripple spreading through still water. She didn't show up at the next HOA meeting. Not that I expected her to. But her absence spoke louder than any of her usual rants about trash bins or grass height. A few days later, an email landed in everyone's inbox with the subject line, "Updated HOA entry and inspection guidelines." No apology, no names mentioned, just a new rule tucked into the third paragraph. It now stated that all inspections must be scheduled in writing at least 7 days in advance, and any attempt to enter private property without homeowner consent would be considered a violation of HOA protocol. In bold at the bottom, a reminder, unauthorized use of emergency services is grounds for review by the board. Subtle, but clear. Everyone knew why the rule had changed. Karen had overstepped, and the HOA wanted to avoid future embarrassment. Neighbors began talking more openly. Some thanked me quietly at the mailbox or during evening walks, relieved that someone had finally drawn the line. One couple even joked that I should run for the board. But I laughed it off. I didn't want a seat at the table. I just wanted my Saturdays back. Karen, for her part, kept her distance. No more sudden visits, no more passive-aggressive notes on windshields. She became a silent figure on the edge of sidewalks, nodding politely when our paths crossed, but never saying a word. The power she once wielded so confidently had lost its sting. Life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Lawns were mowed, dogs were walked, and people finally breathed easier. The message had been delivered, not by confrontation, but by a quiet truth. Sometimes justice doesn't need a gavel, just a calm voice on the other end of the line. A week later, I got a text from my neighbor across the street. It was a link to a video with the title, HOA Karen versus Homeowner. Instant karma. I clicked it, curious, and there it was. My doorbell camera footage, capturing the entire showdown in crystal clear high definition. Karen's demands, her dramatic 911 call, and the priceless moment when the officers gently put her in her place. It was all there, complete with subtitles and dramatic background music someone had clearly added for effect. By noon, the video had thousands of views. By evening, Tens of thousands. Comments flooded in, ranging from disbelief to full-blown internet cheers. "She picked the wrong house," one person wrote. Another simply said, "That dispatcher wife twist? Iconic." Memes began to circulate. One had Karen's photo with the caption, "Knock knock, it's karma." I hadn't planned on going viral, but there it was. People from across the country shared their own HOA horror stories, and my wife, half amused and half embarrassed, became a bit of a cult hero in the comment sections. We didn't seek fame, but somehow, standing firm with a little bit of calm and truth, gave the world exactly the kind of story it needed. The neighborhood settled into a peaceful rhythm again, as if the chaos had been nothing more than a passing storm. Mornings returned to birdsong and quiet coffee, the kind that warms your hands and slows your thoughts. No more surprise inspections, no pounding on doors, no wild accusations floating down the street. Karen became more of a background figure, present but muted, like an old wind chime that no longer catches the breeze. She walked her dog in the early evenings, nodding at neighbors without stopping to chat. The clipboard disappeared. The sun hat stayed, though it somehow seemed a little less commanding. No one mentioned the video in her presence, but everyone had seen it. The silence was its own kind of closure. At home, my wife and I fell back into our routines. She took fewer night shifts, and we spent more weekends side by side, laughing about the time a self-important HOA officer unknowingly called 911 on the dispatcher's husband. It had all started with a fence and a cup of coffee, but it ended with something better. Clearer boundaries, a little more respect, and a reminder that calm doesn't mean weak. Peace wasn't just restored, it was earned, and we planned to keep it that way.